I took care of my second husband for 20 years, cooking, cleaning, managing his medications, and staying by his side through hospital stays, believing all along that it was simply part of being a wife. Then one day, I overheard him in the hospital hallway, chatting with another patient. He laughed and said, "She's basically a free caregiver. When I'm gone, of course the money goes to my son. Nothing left for her." In that moment, everything fell into place. I hadn't been protecting a marriage. I'd been maintaining a lie. And I made up my mind. They were about to learn what real reckoning looks like. I sat on that creaky hospital folding chair, my coffee long gone cold, still holding the cup like it might give me something back. Richard lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to N4, murmuring in his sleep. I'd lost track of how many times I'd seen him in a hospital gown over the years, but something about this visit felt different. The doctor said it was a minor stroke caught early, no major damage. But the aftermath was already clear. He leaned on me more heavily than ever. I wiped his face, turned his body every couple hours, spoon-fed him, massaged his legs while my back throbbed. The nurses praised me like I was some relic from a bygone era. A real wife, one said. They don't make em like this anymore. I smiled. I didn't answer. I'd heard it too many times to feel flattered. Just like everything else in our marriage, I had learned to accept praise in place of partnership, and silence in place of thanks. I stopped asking what it cost me a long time ago. The hospital didn't allow overnight stays for family. So I came in at sunrise. The nurses' station lights were still on. A young man in scrubs was updating charts. I walked past with a paper bag in one hand, coffee and a warm oat muffin, Richard's favorite. The hall reeked of antiseptic. I set the bag gently on the bedside table, only to find the bed empty. "Your husband went down to the courtyard for some air," the nurse said with a nod. Said he wanted a bit of morning sun. I thanked her and headed toward the courtyard. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden lines across the tile floor. It could have been a peaceful moment. I even thought I might push him around the garden a bit. But as I turned the corner, I heard his voice. He was sitting in a wheelchair, speaking to another patient, someone younger, judging by the voice. They were laughing. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I stopped because I froze for what he said there publicly and loudly. He was using that cocky, backslapping tone, something I hadn't heard from him in years. And the words struck like a hammer. "You know, I really lucked out," Richard said. 60-something. Found myself a younger second wife. Didn't cost me a dime, and now she's my full-time caretaker. Cooking, cleaning, doctor visits, you name it. She can even get up every 2 hours to turn me over. Can you believe that? He chuckled, stretching the last line like it was a punchline. Finding a free caregiver these days. Hell, that's a skill. I must have done something right. I stood there, soles glued to the cold tile, my stomach beginning to churn. Richard kept going. "She thinks we've got this great emotional connection. Truth is, I've had the will sorted for a while. Everything goes to Dylan's my only kid. After all, Rachel, she'll be fine. She's got her daughter. Let her move in with her and grow old there. She doesn't need anything from me." The other man gave a low laugh, like he agreed. In that moment, something inside me collapsed. My gut twisted, my eyes burned, but I didn't cry. I couldn't let him see me there. I stepped back slowly, each movement silent as a shadow, retreating down the hall. An orderly pushed a gurney past me, the wheels screeching against the tile, echoing the noise roaring in my chest. I leaned against the wall, eyes closed, breathing in deep, but no breath could quiet what had just broken. I had spent 20 years believing I was an essential part of his life, his partner, his companion in aging. Now I saw what I really was: useful, free labor, a convenient body to lean on. And the worst part, I had meant every sacrifice. I never treated him like a burden. I helped him because I loved him. I endured Dylan's coldness, the way he never looked me in the eye. I stayed silent, thinking someday someone would see me. But now I knew. My kindness had been a currency. My loyalty, a punchline in his private joke. When I returned to the room, Richard was back in bed. He glanced up and smiled. "Did you get breakfast? Don't wear yourself out." "I was just telling someone you're the most dependable person I know." My lip twitched. I said nothing. He thought dependable was a compliment. To him, it was synonymous with replaceable. I stood there and told myself, "Rachel, remember this moment. Not because it hurt, but because it finally showed you the truth. You're still alive. You still have choices." I didn't turn on the lights when I got home that day. It was one of those rare clear afternoons in California, but the house felt as cold as a basement. I sat on the couch in the living room, arms wrapped around myself, completely still like I was trying to hear some distant voice from the past, trying to remember when exactly I started to disappear. This house wasn't mine. It wasn't one I chose, or even liked. It had belonged to Richard and his first wife. When we remarried, he refused to move. "Dylan's used to this place," he said. Moving would be hard on him. Dylan was 15 at the time, taller than me, full of side eyes and cold shoulders. He never called me Mom, barely said Rachel, and even that sounded forced. But I still agreed. I brought 2 boxes of books, 1 cooking pot, and a cat and moved into someone else's past. I thought if I was kind enough, careful enough, maybe they'd let me in. I spent 3 months scrubbing that kitchen from top to bottom, even cleaning grease off the walls with lemon oil. Back then, I was still working at the library. I'd stop for groceries on the way home and cook the meals they liked. That first Thanksgiving, I stayed up 2 nights in a row learning how to roast a turkey the way they liked. When I finally served it, Dylan looked up from his phone just long enough to say, "The gravy's kinda weird." My mom's was better. I didn't argue. I just cleared the plates. I still believed, back then, that patience could change people. Now I know that was the first time this house made me feel invisible. I was there for Richard when he lost his job. I was there when his ex-wife died of cancer. I sat beside him at the funeral, handled the paperwork, poured the tea. He cried over her name, and I held the silence. When Dylan dropped out of college and racked up credit card debt, I pulled money from my retirement account to cover it just so Richard wouldn't have to worry. I did so much for them. I even tried to reshape myself around their world, pretended to like golf, smiled through their disdain for outsiders, endured family events where Richard would conveniently forget to introduce me at all. At his niece's wedding, he turned to a guest and said, "This is Rachel, a friend of the family." I stood there with a wine glass in hand, smiling like I'd been hired for the night. When we got home, I sat in the garage alone and cried for 30 minutes. Then I got up and made dinner. I used to think that was grace. That's what marriage was supposed to look like when you're older. No fairy tales. Just loyalty. Just showing up. But now I understand it wasn't loyalty. It was exploitation. The moment I heard Richard say I was his free caregiver, every piece of patience, sacrifice, and compromise cracked under its own weight and collapsed. And I started to wonder who exactly had been taken care of all these years, who had been doing the sacrificing. Just as that thought settled in my chest, the doorbell rang. I wiped my face, steadied my breath, and opened the door. It was Dylan. He wore a faded hoodie, hands shoved in his pockets, reeking of a mix of cigarettes and detergent. He didn't look at me, just walked straight into the kitchen and opened the fridge. "Where's Dad?" he asked, rummaging. "Doctor said it wasn't too serious." "Right. He told me to grab a few things. He's still in the hospital," I said evenly. "Maybe you should stop by and see him sometime." He shrugged, like I'd asked him to attend jury duty. He pulled out a Coke, popped the tab, and said offhandedly, "I already told him to get the will sorted out, so we don't have any drama later." My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. He sat down at the table, sipping his soda through a straw, chewing as he spoke. "Don't overthink it. This house was never really yours anyway." I didn't respond. But inside, I heard a door slam shut. I stopped wanting to be liked by this boy. I stopped wanting to be the good stepmom. I stopped believing this house, this family had any space in it for me. Because truth was, it never did. I walked over and switched off the kitchen light, leaving only the small amber lamp on by the sink. Dylan frowned. But I didn't care. The day Richard was discharged, the sun was glaringly bright. Almost cruel. The nurse wheeled him to the front entrance of the hospital, and he smiled like a man returning from vacation. "Feels good to be home," he said. I smiled too, but it was the kind that hovered on the surface and went nowhere deeper. For me, home had long since stopped meaning safety. That house, even after 20 years, felt like a temporary loan. The air inside still belonged to someone else. I parked on the slope and helped him into the car. He immediately grumbled that the seat was too stiff. I didn't respond. I just tightened his seatbelt a little more than necessary. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes were closed, head tilted back, like some aging king waiting to be served. Once home, I went through the motions, poured him water, laid out his favorite olive green throw, fluffed the pillow just the way he liked it. He settled onto the couch like nothing had changed, flipping through TV channels, then asked me to find that old Alaska hunting photo book he always liked. He acted as if the hospital hallway never happened. But I knew better. Everything had changed. A few days later, I started organizing his hospital paperwork. That afternoon, I sat at the desk in the study, fingers dry and cracking, flipping through the gray filing cabinet. Insurance statements, payment receipts, medical summaries. His documents were color-coded. Of course, blue for medical, red for bank, yellow for private insurance. When I opened the yellow folder, a piece of paper slipped out and floated to the carpet. I bent to pick it up, expecting a billing statement. Instead, I saw the title, Life Insurance Beneficiaries. And just like that, my heart was sliced not with a sharp cut, but a slow, dull one. Primary beneficiary, Dylan Moore. Secondary beneficiary, Emily Moore. His ex-spouse. My name wasn't on it. Not even as a contingency. I stared at the page, my fingertips trembling slightly. I never cared about the money. I never expected some grand inheritance. But I did believe after 20 years of sharing a life I'd at least be given a place in the ending. Even a symbolic one. Now I understood. I wasn't in his future. I wasn't even considered in the aftermath. The late nights organizing his taxes. The times I cleaned up after his stomach bleeds. The retirement speech I wrote for him when he couldn't string together a paragraph. It was all a joke. He'd planned everything so carefully. His finances, his legacy, even his death. The only thing he hadn't accounted for was me. I put the insurance document back in the folder, not making a sound. That night, we had lasagna for dinner, frozen, store-bought. Halfway through, he frowned. Tastes off. Did you forget the mozzarella? I left it out, I said flatly. He scowled. I've told you I don't want this without cheese. I said nothing. He studied me for a moment. You okay? You've been off lately. I looked up and said, with absolute calm, maybe I've just started seeing things more clearly. He was quiet for a few seconds, like he expected me to explain. I didn't. After dinner, he stretched out on the couch, eyes closed, pretending to meditate. I sat in the armchair across from him, holding a book I didn't even open. My mind was spinning with one question. How do you keep caring for someone who's erased you from their will, their plans, their very sense of partnership? For 2 decades, I thought I was in a marriage, but I was really just hired, paid in guilt, compensated with the illusion of belonging. And instead of a contract, I'd signed with silence. This wasn't a marriage. It was a polished form of exploitation, and I'd played along until now. I set the book down and walked into the kitchen. One by one, I washed the dishes. The hot water ran over my hands. The plates clinked gently in the sink. When I finished, I rested my palms on the counter, closed my eyes, and let the quiet settle in. And a voice inside me finally whispered, Rachel, it's time. Make your move. 2 days later, I finally found the courage to make the call. The phone rang 3 times before Nancy's voice floated through the line like a warm breeze. Hey honey, that you? I was just out back spraying the lilacs, nearly missed the ring. My throat tightened. It took me a moment to speak. Do you have time to talk? She caught the strain in my voice immediately. Her tone shifted. Where are you? Come over. You don't need to say a word. I'll be here. I hung up and didn't waste another second. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. 30 minutes later, I stood in front of her flower shop. She named it herself Bloom on purpose. A little sign by the entrance read, Today's flower message. You don't owe anyone. The wind chime above the door clinked as I stepped in. Nancy didn't hesitate. She pulled me into a hug the second she saw me. That hug almost cracked something inside me. I felt my nose sting, but I held it together. She led me out back to the garden, to a wooden bench nestled under a climbing vine. She poured me a cup of lemon mint tea. I didn't touch it. I just sat there, staring at the pruning shears on her work table. Then I said, quietly, I think I've been split open for years and just didn't know it. She didn't interrupt. Just let me speak. I took a deep breath and told her everything what I heard in the hospital hallway, the insurance paperwork, Dylan's smug cruelty, and Richard's silence. I laid it all out like an autopsy. At one point, I stopped. Voice barely a whisper. I used to think he was just old-fashioned. I didn't realize I was never really family to him. Nancy finally spoke. Her voice was soft but solid. He didn't treat you like family because he never saw you as a person. You weren't his wife, you were his service. I looked at her, unsure what to say. You've been a full-time, unpaid domestic nurse. That's not marriage. That's labor. She paused, her eyes sharp as thorns. Rachel, it's time to wake up. I murmured, I'm 60 years old. Nancy, I don't know where to go. I don't know who I'd be. She didn't let me finish. You could stay with your daughter. Or you could move upstairs. Me tenant just moved out. The studio's yours if you want it. Honestly, I'd be thrilled to have you. I let out a dry laugh. I've never been good with change. I don't know if I'm built for it. She leaned in. Want to know how I left my ex? He ran off with his secretary. I was 29, had a toddler, broke, and my whole family told me to tough it out. You know what I told them? I shook my head. She said it slowly, clearly. I'd rather eat instant noodles in peace than spend one more day pretending a worthless man deserves my silence. That made me laugh. Really laugh for the first time in weeks. She squeezed my hand. You're not weak, Rachel. You're kind. So kind you built a prison with your own compassion and handed the key to someone else. I lowered my head. My eyes were burning. I took a breath and for the first time in days, my chest didn't feel like it was caving in. We sat out there for hours, among the roses and the soil and the soft sound of garden clippers. Before I left, she looked me dead in the eye and said, You're not falling out of favor in old age. You're just finally done being loyal to the wrong people. When I stepped outside the shop, I didn't look back, because I knew once I moved forward, there was no going back. When I got home, it was already dark. The house felt like a hollow shell. The TV downstairs was still on. Richard had left it tuned to one of those late-night finance channels, where some host was rambling about the stock market. Takeout containers sat open on the dining table. A few limp fries spilled onto the wood. This morning's dishes still soaked in the sink. I stood at the doorway, didn't turn on the lights, didn't move, just stared. He didn't even bother pretending anymore. No, thank you. No, how are you holding up? It was like my presence was baked into the walls. Something expected, not acknowledged. Like he assumed I'd always be there, quiet, steady, invisible. But this time, I wasn't going to let him assume. That night, I went into the study and pulled out an old photo. It was of me and Sandra, my daughter from my first marriage. She had just graduated college. In the photo, we were arm in arm, smiling wide. The wind had blown her hair into her face. I was holding a bouquet of carnations. I stared at those flowers for a long time. Then I stood up, opened the closet, and began to pack. This wasn't anger. It wasn't drama. It was clarity. I had to leave that house, a place where I no longer felt like a person. I needed to talk to Sandra. I needed to ask the question that had been crawling up my throat for weeks. Is it too late to begin again? The next morning, I booked a flight to Boston. When I landed, Sandra was already waiting at the terminal. She wore a forest green coat, her hair tied back in a simple knot. Her eyes were equal parts worry and warmth. As soon as I wheeled my luggage into view, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. That hug broke me open. It had been so long since someone touched me without needing something from me. Not a favor, not dinner, not comfort, just me. You look pale, she said, pulling back. I didn't sleep well. I smiled as best I could, but my voice cracked around the edges. She didn't press. She just took my bag and led me to the car. We barely spoke on the drive. She pulled into the driveway of her 2-story house in the Boston suburbs. Her front yard was a garden she'd built by hand. A small mat on the porch read, "Welcome home." I stopped before stepping inside. My throat tightened. "Come in, Mom," she said gently. I made pumpkin soup. Her kitchen was bright, spotless. The table was already set, whole wheat bread in a basket, silverware neatly placed. When I sat down, she brought the soup and sat across from me. Then she looked at me and said, "Tell me what happened." I stirred the soup, blowing on it. Then, suddenly, I started crying. The tears dropped into my bowl like something had finally cracked. I wasn't the kind of woman who cried easily. But in that moment, I realized just how tired I was, how long I'd been denied the space to be fragile. I told her everything. The house that felt like a mausoleum. The hospital hallway. The insurance paperwork. Dylan's cruelty. Richard's coldness. I emptied myself at that table. She listened quietly, only occasionally furrowing her brows like she was holding back a storm. When I finished, she put down her spoon. Her voice was calm but firm. "He didn't just betray your trust, Mom. He violated your dignity. And he made you disappear inside your own life." I gave a small, bitter laugh. But I let him do it. For 20 years. She reached across the table, her eyes softer now. You did what you believed was right. That's not weakness. That's love. But now it's time to love yourself enough to stop. I looked at her and asked, quietly, do you really think I can start over? I'm 60. She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, not the kind people use to make others feel better, but the kind that comes from knowing. Of course you can. You've got experience, wisdom, savings, people who love you, and most importantly, Momiari's still here. You're still alive. I didn't speak, just nodded slowly. We'll go over his assets, she said. Figure out what's legally yours. I know a good lawyer. You don't need revenge, but you do need justice. I sighed. I don't even know where to begin. You already began, she said, getting up to squeeze my shoulder. You left. That night, I stayed in her guest room. Outside the window stood an old oak tree, its branches silhouetted against the moonlight like a sentinel. I lay in bed and pulled out my notebook, the one I'd brought in my bag. The first page read, Year 3 of marriage. Richard built a bench in the backyard. We drank hot chocolate and watched the leaves fall. I turned the page. Then I ripped it out. Not out of anger, but because I finally understood. Not all shared memories are worth keeping. The day after I returned home, I didn't refill Richard's pill organizer like I usually did. Instead, I opened my laptop and typed in a phrase that felt foreign, even a little humiliating. Financial rights for remarried women. The word stung, but I knew it was time. I spent the entire day combing through websites of 3 different law firms, reading case after case about divorce and asset division later in life. Turns out, I wasn't the first woman to wake up at 60. Not the first to realize she'd spent decades in a relationship built on economic control. That afternoon, I submitted a request for a consultation. A local women-led firm scheduled a phone screening with me 3 days later. In the meantime, I started looking for work. I couldn't afford to leave and have nothing of my own. I had experience with editing and admin tasks, so I landed a remote part-time job on a digital content platform. The pay wasn't much, and the hours weren't easy. But that little paycheck, however small, gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. I spent the next few evenings in the study, flipping through old photos and handwritten journals. I found one picture from a work trip to San Francisco over a decade ago. I was standing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, wearing my favorite navy sweater. There was light in my eyes, and a smile that hadn't yet been worn down. Back then, I loved photography. I baked. I visited museums every week. I even wrote a paper on women's oral histories. It never got published, but I was proud of it. I stared at that photo for a long time, and then I remembered how I'd let that version of myself fade. Just then, Richard opened the bedroom door. Dylan said he's coming over for dinner. I paused. Didn't he just come by a few days ago? Richard shrugged. So, you don't have anything else going on? He's bringing his girlfriend. Just make a few more dishes. I didn't argue. I went into the kitchen, but this time, I didn't lift a finger for them. I pulled out frozen leftovers, heated a few things in the microwave, opened 2 canned salads. No effort. No explanation. I wasn't about to cook a gourmet meal for people I was planning to leave. Let them eat, I don't. When they arrived, I was already seated at the table, editing a piece of copy on my laptop. Dylan walked in first. God, this place smells like a nursing home, he said. Nose wrinkled. Dad, how do you stand it? His girlfriend giggled. Didn't you say Rachel was a great cook? This looks worse than takeout. I didn't look up. Just turned another page. Dylan opened the fridge, scanned the contents, then came back to the table and knocked on it with his knuckles. This is it, Rachel. You know my dad's got high blood pressure, right? I looked up and said evenly, if you don't want to eat, you're free to eat somewhere else. Richard frowned. He didn't mean anything by it. Rachel, don't take it so personally. I closed my laptop, looked him square in the eye. So being rude is just stress now. Dylan laughed and turned to his girlfriend. You see what I mean? This is why my dad never added her to his life insurance. They've been married 20 years and she's getting nothing. No way, the girl said, her tone mock-shocked. So what was she even doing here all these years? Dylan shrugged. Some women get off on taking care of old guys, I guess. I stood up, my voice sharp as ice. What I got off on was being naive enough to believe your father was a decent man. Silence. The whole room freezed on my sentence. I looked at Richard. I did everything for you and your son not because I thought I was beneath you, but because I thought you were worth it. I was wrong. Then I turned to Dylan. I never wanted to be your mother. And believe me, I never mistook you for someone worth earning affection from. But at least I know how to treat people with gratitude. With respect. Things you clearly know nothing about. I glanced around the table one last time. This is the last meal I'll ever make in this house. Starting tonight, I'm moving out. And I've already hired a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. Richard's face turned pale, then flushed. He stood up quickly. Rachel, you can't just. I absolutely can. My voice cut through his. This isn't a tantrum. This is a decision. The clearest one I've made in 60 years. I turned and walked into the bedroom, opened the drawer, pulled out the legal consultation letter, and taped it to the back of the door. That moment wasn't just about me leaving them. It was the moment I finally returned to myself. The morning I left that house, the whole street was unusually quiet. I didn't pack much, 2 suitcases, a folder of documents, a small bag of medications. Nancy showed up right on time. She didn't ask questions. Just took a tote of books from my hand and tossed it in the trunk. Richard stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame. His expression hovered somewhere between disbelief and smug amusement. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said plenty. You'll be back. That was always his favorite move, using silence as pressure, using condescension as a leash. But this time, he misread the room. I didn't respond. Just before I shut the door, I looked over my shoulder and said, next time you want a Livian cook, try offering a paycheck. The door clicked shut behind me. And to my surprise, I didn't cry. I didn't feel sadness. Just peace. A quiet, sturdy kind of peace. My new place was a small studio apartment above Nancy's flower shop. Maybe 400 square feet, but clean and warm, with its own kitchen and a west-facing window. Outside was her garden, bursting with tulips just past bloom. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching sunlight dance across the wooden floor, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. No one needed me. No one ordered me around. No one diminished me. There was only me. That night, I cooked just for myself. Roasted butternut squash, a crisp goat cheese salad, a glass of pale Riesling. The oven crackled. The garden breeze carried the scent of flowers through the window. I sat at a tiny table, listening to the old jazz record Nancy had left on the player, humming along as I ate alone. After dinner, I opened my laptop and logged in to the editing platform. There was a message from my editor. Your markups are incredibly sharp. If you're open to it, we'd love to send you more frequent assignments. I smiled. A real, rooted kind of smile. Grateful not for them, but for myself. For having chosen to walk away. I thought Richard would lose his temper within days. But he didn't. Just 2 texts. How long are you planning to drag this out? You really think this won't come back to bite you? I never replied. Nancy told me, don't you dare turn around. If he had an ounce of remorse, you'd have heard something more human than a guilt trip. Dylan didn't show up either. Probably thought life would be easier without me. But I knew what they lost wasn't a woman who served them. It was the last thread holding together the illusion that their house was a home. My days slowly found their rhythm. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, I edited. On weekends, I helped Nancy in the flower shop. The rest of the time, I went to a community college writing class learning how to tell my story in my own damn voice. I started a blog for older women, called Rebirth. The first post was titled, Leaving the House That Never Had My Name. Life didn't become glittering or easy overnight. No fairy tale ending. No sudden windfall. But I no longer waited for someone else to tell me I was worthy. I chose my home again. This time, one with only my name on the door. It was a gray morning the day I met with the lawyer. Sandra had taken the day off to drive me. The firm Willow Hartman was one she knew well, a boutique practice that specialized in financial protection for older women navigating divorce. The office sat above a second-hand bookstore. And as we walked through the narrow front door, I caught the faint scent of coffee mingling with old pages. Our attorney was Karen Yates, a woman in her early 50s wearing a tailored charcoal blazer. She flipped through our stack of documents: marriage certificate, property deeds, years of bank statements with quick, steady hands. Her tone was sharp but not judgmental. So you were married in 2005, she asked, and the house was already in his name at the time. I nodded. But after that, you were the primary caregiver at home, with no personal income. and you took full responsibility for Richard's medical care during his illness. Yes, I said quietly. She let out a soft scribbled a few lines in her notepad, then looked up. Rachel, you're entitled to far more than you realize. I blinked, surprised. She continued. Under California law, you have the right to claim a portion of all postmarital assets, including the growth in his retirement account, investment income, and yes, long-term spousal support. Let me be clear. You're not begging for anything. You're asserting your legal rights. I turned to Sandra, who gave me a quiet nod and squeezed my hand. In that moment, something stirred in Mesamething that had been buried beneath shame and silence for far too long. I was worth it. Karen immediately drafted a temporary protective order to freeze certain account transactions and filed an official notice of separation. Within a week of those documents going out, Richard knew. That afternoon, I'd just returned from helping Nancy at the flower shop when my phone buzzed. Richard Moore. I hesitated for a second, then answered. Rachel, he began. Same low voice. But the edge of authority was gone. You really want to drag decades of marriage into court over this? I didn't reply. He went on. This is going to make everyone look bad. You think that little lawyer of yours can win you something. You're dreaming. I exhaled slowly. She can win what should have been mine all along. He went silent. I didn't wait for another word. I ended the call. A few days later, Dylan showed up. In person. He stormed up to the flower shop, face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. You trying to bankrupt us. You thought you were wise and not to do the right thing. He hissed. I said nothing. Just looked at him. Let me guess. He sneered. Sandra's paying for your little crusade. Right. Thinks she can afford to carry you forever. You're nothing but a parasite. Rachel. You've never been one of us. Nancy stepped outside then, casually wiping her hands on a towel. She didn't raise her voice, but her words were firm enough. Say one more word, she said, and I'm calling the police. Dylan's face flushed red. He backed up a step, then barked. You'll regret this. Don't think you're walking away with anything. Then he turned and left. I didn't go after him. I didn't yell back. I just stood there, repeating his words in my mind, because I wanted to remember. Every syllable. All those years I'd traded my voice for peace only to be met with contempt. Now it was my turn to speak. Karen began the next steps. Submitting requests to access Richard's financial disclosures. He was officially required to provide 10 years of asset activity and income growth. I knew he'd be furious. Because for someone like Richard, money wasn't just wealth. It was power. It was image. It was armor. And transparency. Transparency was humiliation. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. I wanted him to see clearly, maybe for the first time, what he had really built his life on. I was never his free ride. I was just the last person willing to carry him for nothing. The morning of the final ruling. I wore a navy trench coat. No makeup. No earrings. Sandra walked beside me into the courthouse, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, one hand gripping a folder of case files, the other gently holding mine. Her expression was resolute, her stride brisk, and as I walked beside her, I suddenly remembered the days I used to walk her to elementary school back, when I was the one protecting her. Now, it was her turn, not to lead me, but to stand with me. This wasn't a trial. It was a reckoning. The hearing didn't last long. Karen had filed everything with surgical precision. Richard tried to delay. But he had no justification for keeping me out of the shared assets. In fact, during financial disclosure, the court uncovered a quiet transfer he'd made last year. A significant sum moved into Dylan's account. The judge called it what it was, an attempt to circumvent equitable distribution. When the ruling came down, I barely heard anything at all. It felt like I was underwater. Just one word cut through the noise like a blade. Granted. I'd won. I was awarded 1/3 of the marital assets, cash, stock dividends, and savings accrued during the marriage. On top of that, the court mandated 2 years of spousal support at $2,500 a month. There was no sense of triumph, no urge to gloat, just a slow, quiet breath of relief. It wasn't a windfall. It was a reimbursement for 20 years of unpaid labor, emotional erosion, and the silent trade of my identity. After the verdict, I thought it was over. Then, 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the hospital. Richard had suffered a severe hypertensive episode, resulting in reduced cerebral blood flow. He had been admitted to the ICU critical condition. No family present. No one available to sign long-term care authorization. I sat at my desk, the envelope in one hand, unmoving. He looked fine in court's mug, confident. But that ruling, I realized, had stripped away the last illusion of control. For Richard, money wasn't just currency. It was oxygen, power, relevance. And when he lost it, his body followed. I didn't call. I didn't write. I picked up the phone and asked Karen to redirect all hospital correspondence to Dylan. She called me back the next day. It's done, she said. But Dylan isn't cooperating. I wasn't surprised. Dylan, just like his father, only showed up when there was something to gain. After learning that half the assets were now in my name, he probably decided Richard was no longer worth the investment. But none of that mattered to me anymore. A few days later, Nancy was out back trimming roses when she said, almost casually, someone told me Dylan posted online said something like, people who rack up medical debt and still won't die are just wasting space. At least life insurance pays out when they finally go. I nodded, said nothing, because in that moment, I finally understood something. What Richard feared most wasn't illness. It wasn't aging. It wasn't even death. It was this, being left behind with no one left to sacrifice their life for him. He got what he wanted. He gave everything to Dylan. And Dylan, he was just waiting for the final payout. Richard never thought it would end like this. And I never imagined that, standing at the end of his story, I would feel nothing. Not rage. Not grief. Not even pity. Just the quiet recognition. He chose this. And I chose to walk away. Early summer sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains of the flower shop's upstairs window, casting soft shadows across the worn wooden desk. I sat in front of my laptop, an old, thick notebook tucked beneath the keyboard. On the screen was the title of my latest blog draft, From Being Needed to Being Seen. It had taken me 3 days to write, not because it was difficult, but because every word uncovered something I'd buried for years. For the first time, I was telling my story in my own voice. No detours around the pain. No apologies. No filters. I'm now a registered freelance editor, writing for 2 lifestyle platforms and maintaining a small subscriber blog of my own. My audience isn't huge, but it's real. They leave comments like, your writing feels like warm water, gentle, but never weak. Thank you for the courage to say what most of us only feel. That day, Sandra flew in from Boston to visit. As soon as she stepped off the train, she held up a small paper bag with a grin. I brought your favorite brownies. I laughed and took it. There was a sticker on the front she'd made herself. Congratulations, Mom. You're back. She walked into my place and looked around, taking in the new touches, the lightness of the space. You really made this your own, she said. Of course I did. I pointed to the new plaque I'd hung on the wall. The letters carved clean and proud. Rachel's space quiet, curious, free. Nancy had picked it out with me. She said it reflected who I was becoming. Sandra and I sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, catching up. At one point, she asked, have you heard anything about Dylan lately? I shook my head. No, and I'm not interested. She nodded and didn't press. We both knew that the day I stopped needing updates was the day I finally stepped out of their shadow. And now I could say it with no weight in my chest. Whatever happens in their world, it's not mine anymore. After dinner, she pulled out a book from her briefcase, something a colleague at her firm had lent her. It was a collection of case studies about financial independence in older women. I flipped through the pages and found one line she'd highlighted. At any age, choosing not to be obedient is brave. But true freedom is choosing to be fully yourself without asking permission. I folded the corner of that page and looked at her. Do you remember asking me, when you were little, what kind of person do you want to be? She smiled. You said, someone who's trusted, but not taken for granted. I nodded. I finally get it now. If I want others to trust and respect me, I have to trust myself first. We walked out back and helped Nancy arrange a new batch of roses onto the garden rack. I picked the center slot left empty for something special and wrote a name on the little wooden sign. Sandra peered over. Gratitude rose. That's the one. I smiled. Absolutely. It blooms late, but it's steady, just like I feel now. As the sun faded, the string lights above the shop flicked on one by one, casting a golden haze over the quiet alley. I stood at the door, listening to the wind chimes, the laughter drifting from down the street, and the distant hum of passing cars. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like anyone's wife. Not someone's second. Not someone's shadow. Not a forgotten name in someone else's story. Just me. Rachel. And that, finally, was enough.